It's time once again to check in with our monthly review of everything, as always, mostly horror, that I have been reading. Well, as I mentioned in a previous video, life got in the way and I just didn't get around to making one of these monthly review videos in September. But I'm back on schedule, or at least something close to it, so here's the kinda sorta monthly book review for September and October of 2023. As usual, I read a lot of horror. This is, of course, a horror channel, and that is my favorite genre. But there are a few others mixed in, so you never quite know what you're going to get with my reading list. Though, this being an October review, I think y'all know there are going to be some Halloween-specific ones in the mix for this month. As always, if you're interested in checking out any of these books for yourselves, there will be purchase links down in the What's It, where you can get copies and support my work here on this channel all at the same time. So be sure to read all the stuff down there and check out some wonderful books. But without further ado, let's get right into it. First up was this book, Burnt Offerings by Robert Marasco. This is the tale of a family who move into a sort of grand mansion for the summer, accepting a too good to be true kind of a deal in terms of price. Well, as we all know, especially in the horror genre, anything that seems too good to be true very likely is too good to be true. In this case, things start to seem particularly strange when they're told, before they move in, that the house won't be empty. Instead, they'll be responsible for bringing meal trays 3 times a day to the reclusive elderly Mrs. Allardyce, who lives on the top floor of the house. But the mysterious woman never seems to emerge from her bedroom, and the family gradually start to behave strangely toward each other as the story progresses. If you think this story of a family moving into a large remote location and then starting to behave oddly toward each other sounds a bit familiar, perhaps a bit like The Shining, you're not wrong. But you do need to realize this novel predates King's by several years and is even acknowledged as an influence on the more famous work. So, of course, it's probably inevitable that the two novels are going to be compared. In this case, I think I can say with some confidence that Burnt Offerings never quite manages to be as scary as King's novel. However, it treats the reader to a sophisticated intellectual sort of horror that's likely to be quite memorable for most readers. It's indeed quite refreshing to read a book that never seems to insult the reader's intelligence, as far too many books these days seem to do, and spends a lot of time on genuine character development rather than just forced scares. Despite its relatively short length, it's a bit slower of a read than several books I've gone through lately, but it rewards the reader's effort with a surreal ending you won't soon forget. Our second book really has nothing in particular to do with horror, but I read it in preparation for an interview with the author on my podcast, to which, by the way, you'll find a link also down in the What's It if you'd like to listen. The book in question is called That Guy, a Cautionary Memoir by Larry Hankin. You might not recognize the name Larry Hankin when you're first told about this book, or indeed whenever you hear his name in general, but take a look at his photo on the cover of the book and you'll instantly recognize him as that guy, just as the title suggests. As an actor, he's been in just about everything, apparently. This book is the story of that remarkable career. Though presented in at least approximately chronological order, there's not much of an overarching theme or narrative here. It's written more as a series of vignettes about Hankin's various experiences as he developed his acting career, even though acting wasn't necessarily his goal in the first place. And the author's stream of consciousness style of writing certainly does take some getting used to. Those factors, the lack of ordinary narrative and the stream of consciousness writing style, ordinarily would count against a book for me, and I admit that I wasn't initially impressed by the first few pages of this book. However, as I got used to the style and the stories became increasingly interesting, sometimes funny, sometimes just bizarre, I found I couldn't easily put the book down. I don't know, however, if this book is for everyone, but if you're looking for something a little offbeat, you might want to give it a try. And if you're looking for an insider's perspective of show business, it's certainly worth a read. Behind all the glamour, there's a very strange industry at work, and perhaps it takes a slightly strange character like Larry Hankin to tell it like it is. And then the last one I was able to get through in September, due both to the book's length, although it's not that long, but it's let's say weighty, and also due to the fact that I was just busier than a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. The last book I got through in September was Milton's Paradise Lost. I should mention this particular volume contains both Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. I only read the first one for September. Now, on some level, it doesn't even seem right to review a book like this. Not only is it obviously a classic work and an amazing literary achievement, but it was so influential that it even shaped a lot of what we now accept as standard theology for a lot of people. So I'm not going to belabor the point here. Suffice it to say that Paradise Lost is one of the triumphs of English literature, and it was about time I should reread it. If you haven't read it yet, you really ought to. Is this a horror story? I think I could make that argument, but the real answer is that it's one of those rarest of works that completely transcends any genre boundaries whatsoever. And with that, I then moved into the month of October and began my Halloween-specific reading with Scary Bastard by Aaron Beauregard. I've read Beauregard's work before. His novel The Slob is one of those rare books that, while it didn't exactly scare me, it didn't sort of make me sleep with the lights on, it did manage to get under my skin in a way that few horror novels can. So I knew to expect a work of extreme horror, and I was hoping for something that would really get me for this Halloween season. This book didn't quite get the job done when it comes to really getting under my skin in that way, but it did deliver a fun, fairly extreme Halloween read. The gore and the kills are as over-the-top and entertaining as we would expect from a Beauregard novel, and the Halloween setting gives it that little extra bit of fun. Don't expect this to be for most people, though. This is assuredly only for fans of extreme horror. A large number of the characters, including but not limited to the titular villain, are completely repulsive, but intentionally so. However, I found myself wanting to spend a bit more time with the few characters that were actually likable, not to undercut the horrors of other scenes or characters, but to sort of emphasize them by contrast. Where this book really shines, I think, is in taking the standard Halloween slasher tropes and injecting them with the kind of brutality most people, fans of extreme horror aside, have never read or seen. Let's face it, as much as many of us love the classic slasher movies, they've left us so jaded it might take something like this book to breathe horrific new life into the subgenre. Alright, the next one we need to discuss is The Last Haunt by Max Booth III. This is a strange little book, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect from it. The subtitle is An Oral History of the McKinley Manor Massacre. Obviously, that name is strikingly similar to that of an infamous so-called extreme haunted house attraction that allegedly subjects people, with their own consent, to real-life torture instead of just jump scares and creepy atmosphere. And also, supposedly, offers a prize for anyone who could make it through the entire experience. Although there's some doubt about whether the prize actually exists. And saying that, I think I might be tipping my hand a little bit and letting you on that that place has been the subject of controversy for years, basically since it opened. This book starts with that premise, fictionalizing the haunt, but keeping the details, at least as far as I've been able to determine, largely intact. Though this is a horror novel, and a perfect one to read around the Halloween season due to its plot surrounding a traditionally seasonal kind of event, much of the book doesn't actually read like a horror novel. It reads more like an exposé of the extreme haunted house. And honestly, while I might have been expecting, and perhaps even hoping for something scarier, I think this is a book people interested in that real haunted house really need to read, because the author has clearly done his homework, and the portrait he paints of an extreme haunt more interested in controversy and publicity than in actually delivering an experience for the clients seems entirely accurate based on all the available information I've been able to gather from other journalists, investigators, and former clients of the haunt who've spoken publicly about it. However, lest you think this is a non-fiction story, it does take a turn about halfway through when tragedy strikes at the haunted house, leading the characters into a true horror story. While it may not be, or really even attempt to be, as truly scary as many other horror novels, it does treat the reader to some delightfully creepy scenes. It's a short little book, but you'll be interested enough to see just where this bizarre story ends up that you should be able to finish it easily in a single sitting, and you're likely to be left wanting more, which is a wonderful thing to say about any book. I then read my 2 book club books for the month of October. These ones weren't particularly Halloween themed, as the rest of my October reading was, but they're part of my Halloween reading anyway because the book club itself has become something of an annual tradition over the last couple of years. The first of those books was A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. This one is about a woman who returns home to find her mother has been acting a bit strangely. At first it's just small things, but she gets increasingly disturbed as more and more things seem out of place or out of character. Honestly, it's not particularly scary. It's what I'd call a sort of cozy horror novel. It has a lot of horror tropes and a lot of horror elements, but rather than trying to really frighten you, it tries to deliver some mild creepiness with a light touch and some humor. I hesitate to spoil too much because it occurs late in the book, but suffice it to say, one character in particular provided a rather memorable set of laughs for me. And in many ways, though it's not explicitly a Halloween book, it seems a perfect fit for the season because it treats its horror delicately enough to feel like the sort of thing you'd want to read just as the evenings start to get colder. I've read this author once before and was similarly impressed by that book, so I think I'll keep coming back for more. The second book club pick was this one, Mary, An Awakening of Terror by Nat Cassidy. This is an interesting book about a woman who returns to her childhood hometown, so we have kind of a common theme between the 2 books. But in this case, she has few memories of said childhood. But things seem a little bit strange in this town, and she begins hallucinating, writing things she has no memory of writing, things she doesn't even understand, and then people start dying. And it all seems connected to a serial killer who'd been captured and killed decades before. It's rather difficult to review this book because so many of my thoughts can only really be understood in the context of knowing certain elements of the plot that aren't revealed until relatively late. However, I'm determined to provide a spoiler-free review, so I'll try to be vague about a few of these things and do my best. I suppose a good way to start would be to simply say that within the first few pages, I thought I had a pretty good idea of where the book was headed. I've read enough horror that I very frequently can predict the outcome of a book or a movie rather early. In this case, even after navigating a few twists and turns that seem designed to throw the reader off the right path, I did still have a lot of it figured out really right from the start. But then, even after revealing that I had in fact been correct, it took another massive turn and revealed that though I wasn't wrong, my prediction was correct, there was also a lot more going on. There were more moving parts than I'd originally anticipated. So in that regard, it does a good job of keeping the reader guessing throughout. The characters are, for the most part, well crafted and realistic. The lead character is largely relatable, if not entirely likable. And since the story is told from her perspective, trying to figure her out is a big part of what makes the book really interesting. She's not actually my favorite character in the story, though. That honor belongs to one of the supporting cast for reasons I can't explain without spoiling the ending, so take that as just a bit of a teaser. With regard to the ending itself, that's where I think the book went off track a little bit. I was seriously enjoying the read right up until the climax, but I felt like that climax, and particularly the denouement, while not entirely unbelievable, sort of sacrificed the quality of the story in favor of portraying the author's message perhaps a bit too bluntly. Nevertheless, I still recommend it despite my complaints about the ending, and let's be completely honest, ending horror stories is difficult, so if I couldn't look past a slightly less than perfect ending, the genre would be a pretty barren field indeed. The next one in my October Halloween reading was a book called What October Brings, a Lovecraftian celebration of Halloween. This is an anthology of Lovecraft-inspired horror stories that take place on or around Halloween. That sounds right up my alley, so I was really excited to dig right into this one. I love a good Halloween story, and Lovecraft is, of course, one of my very favorite authors. And my excitement even grew when I looked at the table of contents and saw several well-known horror authors whose work I've typically enjoyed in the past. However, that excitement faltered a little bit when I read the introduction and found enough editorial errors to raise some questions about the book's quality control. Not that the introduction was bad, but it had some errors in it. But I read on, and I'm glad that I did. Though it's a bit of a mixed bag, some of the stories are definite successes. Overall, the sense I got upon finishing the book was of an interesting experiment in setting Lovecraftian themes in a variety of voices and all around everyone's favorite holiday. As happens with any experiment, some of the efforts were resounding successes, and others fell a bit flat. At the end of the day, I don't think any were complete failures. I didn't hate any of the stories, but I also wasn't really blown away by most of them. I was blown away by a couple, and most were good, and a couple didn't really do much for me. It's certainly a good book, and if you're a Lovecraft fan, I think it should definitely be on your October reading list. But likely only a few of its stories will really stick in your memory, so while it's very good, I'm reluctant to call it a great book. Next up, surprise, surprise, is another anthology. This one is called Literally Dead, Tales of Halloween Hauntings. And though I certainly didn't hate the previous one, I do think this one was a bit more successful. This anthology is full of some great writers. The table of contents, as a matter of fact, reads like something of a who's who of modern horror. So my expectations were rather high going in, and I wasn't disappointed. Were all of the stories knockout successes? Of course not. I've yet to find the anthology that's 100% on point for any given reader. But what I can say is that the vast majority of the stories range from good to great. And it's also a perfect seasonal book because the stories manage to evoke a lot of classical or nostalgic senses of what autumn and the Halloween season ought to be about. It's also beautifully laid out and is honestly on track to become a seasonal favorite of mine. It's come to my attention that this is actually part of a series of other holiday-themed horror anthologies, and I, for one, can't wait to dive into the rest of them if they're anything at all like this one. Alas, that's as far as I got. I'd planned a couple other Halloween reads, but my life has just gotten so chaotic that I didn't quite make it through my list, so a few are going to have to either be deferred until next October or at least until whenever I happen to get around to them. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Do be sure to like, share, subscribe, and all those YouTube-y things. And of course, check out all of these books down in the What's It. Stay tuned for some exciting news on this channel a bit later this month. And as always, take care and stay scared.